You're listening to Marcus Gill Presents Antarctica Expert Interviews. Get the most out of your Antarctica adventure by learning practical how-to knowledge and listening to the fascinating stories shared by the world's leading experts on your Antarctica itinerary. And be sure to read the video description for more information on how to prepare for your own Antarctica cruise. Now, here's Marcus.
Welcome to another exciting episode of Antarctica Expert Interviews. This is a really good one because it's actually my father. I did not realize this until recently, within the past year, that he spent 6 months in Antarctica. He served on the same ship as my other guest, Dr. Robert Bunis. They served at different times. But yeah, this was a really special moment for me to realize this, that he not only served his time in the Coast Guard in Antarctica, but it was part of a longer mission where he went up to the Arctic. And we may talk about that in another episode. But this one is focused on my father spending his time in Antarctica. He even played baseball in Antarctica. So our parents never stop surprising us. So this interview is with Chris Templeton, who does a great job interviewing my father, Charles Nathaniel Gill, on his time in Antarctica.
Now, here is your host, Chris Templeton.
Welcome to the Antarctica podcast. I'm your host, Chris Templeton, and I'm here with somebody who has such a fabulous background to talk about Antarctica. I'm here with Mr. Charles Gill. Charles, welcome and thank you for being here.
I appreciate you giving me this interview.
It's our pleasure. I'll tell you what, one of the things that fascinates me is that you were in the Coast Guard. I have a long relationship with loving the Coast Guard since I was a kid, as my parents were sailors. Talk a little bit about when you were in the Coast Guard and how you ended up there, Charles.
Well, I went in the Coast Guard during the Vietnam War, and I just happened to run into a classmate of mine who graduated a year ahead of me, and he had just come back in this funny-looking uniform. And I'm like, what is that you're wearing? And he says, you never heard of the Coast Guard? I said, no. And that's when he told me about it. And he said, yeah, and I just got back from Vietnam. I said, oh, okay. Well, Vietnam was a big issue at that time. It was going on pretty strong. And I was already eligible for the draft, just waiting to be called. And I went down and talked to a Coast Guard recruiter, took the exam, passed it, and signed up for the Coast Guard shortly thereafter.
What was it about the Coast Guard that appealed to you, Charles?
Well, one of the safety factor was the Coast Guard was involved in the Vietnam War, but they were doing river patrols. They weren't actually trekking through the jungles and digging trenches and all that, but they were involved in firefights, but it was from a distance out on the water, not on land. And he told me that's about the safest way that you were going to be involved in the Vietnamese War. But every branch of the military was sent to Vietnam. It didn't matter what your job description was or, what branch it was. You were going to Vietnam. That's the main thing that attracted me to the Coast Guard. But also when I went to the orientation at the recruiting office and they showed me the missions of the Coast Guard was life-saving as well as search and rescue, dealing with not so much drugs at that particular time. That didn't become an issue until much later. And, and the travel. My main goal was to get away from my hometown and get out there and see the world. And that was another thing that was promised to me.
One of the things that fascinates me is I had no idea that the Coast Guard was involved in the Vietnam War.
Oh, yeah. It was at that, during that era, it was checking ships coming in to make sure they weren't bringing in supplies to the enemy, and almost like police officers on the water, and also to give support to the troops on the shorelines that were under enemy fire, and giving them, backup to get them out of danger, and to just be there when needed.
Be a great support, right?
Yes, sir.
So, did you end up in Vietnam yourself?
No, fortunately for me, because by the time I went in, about 8 months after that, Nixon started pulling troops out of Vietnam. So I wasn't concerned with it at that time. I was on the Coast Guard was on the what you call a readiness list if it became necessary. But for me, it never became necessary. So I did most of my time in the United States.
And what were you doing for the Coast Guard? What was your role?
I was what you call a yeoman, an administrative assistant. But in the Coast Guard, because it's so small, you have a plethora of duties, like learning how to operate patrol boats. You're out on doing patrols and carrying a weapon and inspecting cargo ships that came into American ports. So during the day, you could be sitting behind the desk doing paperwork and dealing with personnel records. And at night, if you had duty that day, that evening, then you spent the rest of the evening, doing whatever was called for. If you got a search and rescue call, you were out there looking for someone who was lost. Or if you got a notification that drugs were coming into a certain location, you were part of a group that would go out to that location and almost like surveillance, like police surveillance, and just wait to see what would happen.
So tell everybody how you ended up, or how your ship ended up going to Antarctica.
Okay, well, let me see. I went in 71, and in 1974, I got an assignment to go to an icebreaker, which is called the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Glacier. And it was 312 feet long, and it was one of the largest icebreakers at that particular time. And I got assigned to that. And 3 months after I got on board, we deployed to go to the South Pole, Antarctica. And that's how I ended up there. And we were down there for a little more than 6 months.
No kidding. Wow. And what was your role down there?
Well, the purpose was, since that was during the wintertime, we would go down and break the ice up in the bays where the weather stations were located. And also because the supply ships had to get in there, and if the bays and waterways froze over, then they wouldn't be able to get through. So our duty was to go down there and break up as much ice as possible so that they could get through, release their supplies, and get out of there safely. So we were constantly breaking ice before they got there, while they were there, and in the process of them leaving. We were still down there breaking ice.
When you are sailing down there and you see Antarctica for the first time, what's that experience like?
Like you wouldn't believe. That was one of the most dynamic things, adventures or whatever events that ever happened in my life, because here I am, an inner city kid from Philadelphia, 19 years, well, I was 22 years old at that time. And now I'm down here in the South Pole looking at penguins and killer whales and that type of life. And then when we finally got into the ice, that was, like nothing I had ever imagined. So I was totally overwhelmed. Basically, most of the time I was down there, because if I wasn't in the office working, I was out on the decks looking out at the ice, contemplating, how I would convince people back home that this is what I had done. Because I thought I wouldn't have believed it if somebody told me they did it. So why would I expect anybody to believe me?
And were you able to convince them?
Well, I looked up and took pictures until my camera froze over and broke.
No kidding.
Yeah, it's through your ignorance, you do stupid things, and you pay the consequence for it. I had my camera out, I'm taking pictures, and all of a sudden, nothing.
Oh.
And it was about maybe 32 degrees below zero.
Oh, baby.
And it just didn't dawn on me, you pull your camera out, take a couple pictures, and put the camera back inside your clothes to let your body heat, keep it from freezing over.
Right.
And that's what happened. So I was only able to take maybe about 5 pictures before that occurred, and then it would fall on the good graces of people who were more experienced than me. And since we had a photo lab on the ship, they got their pictures developed and they gave me copies of theirs.
I'll be. So when you start breaking ice and you're coming into Antarctica, what is it like? It must be really overwhelming to be pushing through ice. I imagine the ship makes a lot of noise as it's going through the ice. What's that experience like?
Okay, imagine you're sitting in a room and there's absolutely no noise at all. The room is bobbing and weaving with the waves. That's it. And then all of a sudden, you hit your first crust of ice, and it's almost deafening because the bottom of the ship is shaped like a football, so it goes up on the ice, and the weight of the ship is what breaks the ice.
Huh.
And depending on the thickness, also determines how much noise you're going to encounter. So you go from total silence for about a month until you hit the ice, and then it's 24/7, crash, 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 just literally tearing through the ice, and there's no let up. You have to learn how to sleep in that noise because that's part of the mission.
I imagine that the first few times you're going through this ice, it's got to be really disconcerting. But over time, do you find that you just kind of sublimate it and you just kind of get used to it?
Yeah, you don't have a choice. As a matter of fact, I'll be honest with you, you become so agitated by it, you start to take it personal. Like you think, okay, they're doing this just to get on my nerves.
Boy.
But that's just the immature naiveness at that stage that I was in, because I was going through something that I had never experienced before in my life. And it just seemed to be no end to it at all. And then I started noticing my shipmates that had been there. There were guys that this was their 4th and 5th time going. And they, just went through their daily life. So I started imitating them, and I found out that was one of the best ways to adjust to it. Just deal with it the way they were dealing with it.
When you were down there, did you go into a port? Were you able to get onto the Antarctica itself?
Well, we were, I want to say, about maybe, now we're going back the distance, maybe about 300 miles from the pole itself. But we were in the bays of the continent of Antarctica. So yeah, we did land on Antarctica itself, and we went up there was a weather station there, and they they treated us like royalty because they knew we were there without us, they couldn't survive. And we went in there and they fed us. They gave us souvenirs. They took us on a tour of the weather station, and we even got out on the ice and played baseball.
No kidding.
No kidding. But we also had a barbecue, but we cooked the meals inside the station. And since there were so many of us, we had to stand outside and eat on the ice. But we had special weather gear, like our boots were 3 inches thick as far as the sole and the heel, to keep your feet off the ice. And then the interior of the boot had some kind of leather and suede material to help you preserve your body temperature. And then we had special jackets and pants to wear that were issued to us.
When the first time you got off the ship onto Antarctica, what was that experience like?
I was scared.
Really?
I couldn't imagine that ice being thick enough to hold a man's body, But then once I got down on the ice itself, and then I looked back and I realized the ship is sitting on the ice.
Right.
I would have to take everything in filters, one thing at a time. And they say, yeah, you can go down there, and I'm looking down at all these people running around, all my shipmates running around, doing whatever it was they were doing. And, here I was, like I said, inner city kid, straight out of the streets of Philadelphia, and you want me to walk around on an ice cap? And sure enough, got out there and had a ball. We were out there for hours.
What was your impression of just what you could see? Was it all just white everywhere you looked?
Yes, that's exactly what it was. It was white everywhere you looked. And it was daylight 24 hours a day.
Mm. Right.
So there were a lot of, not a lot, but there was more than usual dissension in the troops, within the troops, within the crew members, because, a lot of us weren't used to that,
Right.
You come out and the sun is still out, and, somebody says, hey man, what time is it? You say, 9 o'clock, morning or night, I don't know. Don't ask me. Tempers would flare. And it's just something you had to get used to because it was part of the job.
And at some point you do get used to it and things settle down. Is that kind of just like when you get there initially, or was that something that was ongoing?
You get used to it after a while because you have a job to do, regardless of what was going on in your surroundings. But you also had, you had to just kind of neglect what you were going through because that's what the mission called for.
Right.
You couldn't get out there and say, well, I don't feel like doing this, and I don't feel like. Everybody had a mission. I'm talking about even from the lowest ranked person to the highest ranked person. Everybody had a job to do. And if you didn't do it, it could cause a problem, even cost somebody their life if you didn't do your job.
The stakes are much higher when you're in that kind of environment, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And if it's something that you're not used to, like I was, you have to seek out individuals. I mean, I would strike up conversations with guys that were sitting off on the side by themselves, and somebody say, oh, yeah, this is his fifth cruise. And I'll be, really? And I go over and start talking to her. Hey, man, how you doing? You know, how's the family? Because we would get mail every once in a while. And they started telling me their life story as far as their experiences, which helped me to blend in and start getting it right.
Getting it right must have been a fascinating process. I mean, going from being a kid that never dreamed that you'd be in that place, and then being in this place that's so cold and so unforgiving. What's that process like?
It's daunting. It's very unlike anything else that you mentally that you can imagine going through, because there's no let up. Once you go from floating out in the ocean to get there, and the ship is bobbing and weaving and tilting and all this other good stuff, and you're seeing all these huge waves come at you, and then all of a sudden, and they announce it about 24 hours, they say, we'll be in the ice by tomorrow. And you're, yeah, okay, whatever. And you're sitting there eating or sleeping, if you can get a chance to sleep, and all of a sudden, it's like two water buffaloes running into each other. And it never stops. It never stops. The ship is not equipped to run into the ice. It's equipped, like I said, shaped like a football on the bottom, so it goes up on the ice, and then the weight of the ship breaks the ice.
Huh.
It's not equipped to run into an iceberg. Not
Right.
at all.
Got it. I imagine the other thing that you had to really come to terms with was the cold.
Yeah, you're right. And it's a cold, like, okay, if you're from somewhere like Wisconsin or Ohio, where you are, that's how you were born and raised, in ice weather and that type of thing. Yeah, that would have been more suitable. And that's what it was like being down there. You know, your body goes through changes. You're constantly feeling flu-like symptoms until your body makes the full adjustment.
Huh.
And then you just, you go from a runny nose to a run in your mouth. Because you're finally glad that, your body has caught up with your environment.
Right. Makes total sense. When you were on the continent itself, other than the weather station, was there anything else going on down there where you were?
No, just the wildlife, the penguins and the seagulls and the killer whales and the leopard seals and those type of creatures, and they just they were built for it.
Right.
And it was just totally one experience after another.
What were some of those experiences like, seeing those animals? And I mean, at some level, I imagine that you're just like, how in the world are they doing this, surviving in this cold?
Yeah, you wonder about that, but hey, Mother Nature is a fickle individual. The good Lord created these creatures, and they were dealing with it, and they look like they made it so easy. Here these penguins are walking around with their tuxedos on, just flopping on their stomach and sliding around, and you wondering how do they do it, but their interior is built for it, and also they have communities where when the wind is really kicking up, they gather around each other and let their body heat, they share their body heat. And the other creatures, like the leopard seals and all that. I don't know how they do it. I honestly don't. They just they're out there, and the killer whales, they're same thing. Their body is dealing with it. So you have to be a scientist or a biologist to be able to break it down.
It must have been so awe-inspiring, so just kind of almost incomprehensible to be down there and see all this wildlife behaving like, hey, this is no big deal.
Yeah, it's like human beings. We have a tragedy that occurs, and the community comes together and starts putting it all back together again.
Yeah.
Knowing that there's a good chance it might happen again the next year, and they just proceed on with their way of dealing with it as a community, as a people, as a neighbor, and just showing love for one another without all the it's almost like sometimes things are meant to happen to bring a community together.
Yes.
It might, they say everything happens for a reason.
Yep.
And when there's certain things occurring in a community, and then all of a sudden an act of nature comes through, and same way down there, the wind picks up and it's kicking their butts, and these penguins join together and they stand fast, and they the male carries the eggs inside his body, and they just gather together and just share what they have.
And I think there's a whole lot less complaining about it, don't you think?
Oh yeah, they get loud though. They get deafening loud.
We've got to wrap up, but I want to just ask you a couple of quick last questions. When you think about your experience and who you were before you got on that ship and who you were after, what do you think Antarctica taught you?
It taught me to appreciate the things that were right there in front of me at a very young age. It taught me to not be so foolish or stupid as I used to be. And that doesn't mean I didn't make mistakes. It's just that, it made me appreciate my own existence.
Yeah.
And, once I got off, I made another trip up to the North Pole after that.
Oh.
But once I got off that ship, I was done.
Enough of that cold stuff. Does it surprise you that this has become a destination for tourism, both poles, but in particular Antarctica?
No, not at all. Because it's beautiful. And if you are with people who have the experience and wherewithal to get you into areas that don't pose an immediate threat,
right,
it's an experience that you will never forget. Some people may go back again 2 or 3 more times.
Yeah.
Just for that. It's a beauty that you can't get enough of. People take pictures, they paint pictures, the whole 9 yards. They write poems, they write books all about it, and you can't exaggerate it because it's just that overwhelming, and you can't not tell it because it's just that impressive.
Wow. It's a great way to frame it up. Last question. When you think about your experience and people that are interested in visiting that, what's the thing that you want them to know more than anything else?
Do your research. Find out what type of attire you need to wear while you're there so that you can be comfortable enjoying while you're there. Because if you don't wear the proper clothing, you're going to be miserable. And we all know some people can deal with the heat, some people can deal with the cold, but that's a cold up there that you would rather be over-prepared than under-prepared. And I mean mentally as well as physically.
It's amazing the experience that you've had. So much of what's important today was important then. And being, as you put it, comfortable in the cold is a whole lot more enjoyable and rewarding than being freezing in the cold.
Exactly. Because there's no way you can pretend not to be cold if you are.
Right. Charles Gill, I really appreciate the time that you took to be here with us today and revisit your 49 years ago trip to Antarctica. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the call, and thank you for the invite. And if you're going, be safe, my friend.
Thank you for listening to Marcus Gill Presents Antarctica Expert Interviews. And be sure to read the video description for more information on how to prepare for your own Antarctica cruise.